Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining Fraction's new next peer-to-peer webinar this afternoon. Next slide, Gaurang. So just to say something a little about Fraction as intro, but before coming to the most important part today, the presentation and speakers. So just setting out once again, Fraction's very bold ambition to begin to change how biopharma works. And we're doing that revolutionising the way works get done in pharma and biotech by leveraging a growing connected network of fractional experts. You may have seen in the last few days, we've actually reached 1,000 members globally at Fraction, and a really tremendous milestone we see it as. From very, very small acorns, just a few of us in a room back in London a couple of years ago, we've now expanded this global network to 1,000 people. So, big pat on the back to everybody. Thank you for being part of our growth and journey in that way. But as the network grows, we provide access to a very large pool of functional expertise, which can identify and precisely address core challenges, delivering high-impact fractional support. And really, our clients benefit from a seamless access to our global network of expertise, supporting them to think, take decisive action, and very often move forward very confidently in areas that they don't fully understand. And I think that speaks again to today's speakers and the presentation, looking at clinical trials and maybe how we can do that differently into the future. So with that, next slide, Gaurang. Okay, so I'll let our speakers introduce the title properly, but so just to say something about our two speakers today, Kimberly Finn and Gaurang Majmudar. Kim is a seasoned executive with 30 years experience in pharmaceutical CRO professional, focusing on R&D operations and building innovative service lines within traditional and decentralized clinical trial arena, resulting in increased patient centricity and expedited delivery of clinical programs. So welcome, Kim. Gaurang, likewise, is a pharmaceutical professional with 30 years track record of delivering excellence both strategically and commercially. He has executive experience across the pharmaceutical development lifecycle in roles that actually uniquely span both clinical operations and commercialization. His focus over the last 15 years has been on patient centricity across commercial specialty medicines and global decentralized DC clinical trials, DCTs. Kim and Gaurang actually came together, I think in recent times, to form Bioclinical Solutions, which is an organisation which supports biotech and pharma design and operationalised clinical trials, with a focus on patient experience while merging operational strategy and excellence together with advanced technologies. So thank you, Gaurang and Kim. I shall pass over to you now to take us through your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Nigel. I couldn't have written it better myself.
Oh, there we go.
Yes. First of all, thank you for those of you that are on the call. I really appreciate you making the time to attend. What we want to cover here, and we've left the title deliberately provocative, I think, in a little bit of way, is there is lots of talk about patient experience and patient centricity. Every conference I've been to for the last 5 years in this space has had streams talking about patient centricity and how to do that. And it is absolutely critical that we get it right for patients. It's clear that, if we get a study right, built correctly for patients, then that will go better. But in doing so, we mustn't forget that sites also have a role to play in this, which is critical too. They bring a lot of expertise, they bring a lot of knowledge. Is that okay? Sorry, somebody say something in terms of sound.
Yeah, I think we're okay, Gaurang.
Is that okay? Okay, so they bring a lot of knowledge as well. So we mustn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as it were. So that's why we kept this title this way. We want to show that it is possible to do both and, discuss with you. An opening question for those that are there. I'm assuming that everybody has experience here of clinical trials or DCTs. Thumbs up, just easy, because you're almost all on group 1, 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tom, yeah. So most of you understand clinical trials and understand decentralized studies. Brilliant. Okay. One other thing, we're a small group, so if anybody's got questions, stop us along the way and ask questions. Let's have a discussion about it as well. I don't, we're happy to talk as we go. Just to start off, I thought it'd be good to understand why a clinical trial is important. We all work in the pharma space. We all, at one point of it or another, clinical trials are the lifeblood of pharma. This is where the R&D starts. This is where the products come through that eventually go through to commercialization. And pharma spends a lot of time and effort in this. In sort of headline numbers, pharma spent about 190 billion last year on R&D, and that includes development work as well as buying development programs. And this is big pharma, it's particularly. But that's a huge number. If we look at what was spent on clinical trials, the last set of data that I managed to find was that 80 billion in 23 was spent on clinical trials, and we expect that to grow to over 123 by 2030. So significant growth in terms of spend going into the clinical trials market. And if we translate that into the number of studies that have started in the last couple of years, you can see that naturally when COVID was running, there was a explosion of studies. The market went up, the number of studies started, whereas we were looking for vaccines, we were looking for treatments, etc. And those of us that were in that space working, trying to deliver those studies will know how manic that was. And a lot of studies, couldn't take place at sites and had to be moved elsewhere. And we'll look at that a little bit later. But after COVID, the numbers started going down. But thankfully, they've stabilized now. And you can see there's about 5,300 studies that started last year. And there's a good pipeline of phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 studies coming through. Based on experience, and this is where we start getting into the discussion, a significant number of those studies will not run as efficiently as planned, and the expenditure will not be as planned. And this is where we need to do things differently.
Okay, as Gaurang just demonstrated, right, there is no shortage of clinical trials that are starting year over year, and there's no shortage of trials that are ongoing, for many years that need to be managed and need solid operational strategies for their clinical trials. But the reality is that there are many challenges associated with the traditional brick and mortar site clinical trial. So the main challenges here are related to recruitment and dropout rates. And as you can see on the slide here, at least 80% plus of clinical trials are delayed with recruitment challenges. So inclusion, exclusion criteria, screening procedures, et cetera. And on the flip side of that, from a retention standpoint, at least 20 to 40% of trials have retention issues, right? Early term withdrawal patients throughout the life cycle of a trial. And that number can go to well above 50% for more complex indications, as well as more restrictive inclusion-exclusion criteria. And we know that about 10% of sites are also challenged with enrolling a single patient. So out of all the sites that are started up for a clinical trial, 10%, at least 10% never even see a patient. Many of these challenges are all related to, as I mentioned, inclusion-exclusion criteria, really intense schedule of observations. And it's important to talk to sites about those parameters at the very beginning when you're writing protocols. So these delays, what do they overall mean for a sponsor? If you have 70% of trials that are delayed outside of the original projected enrollment periods or their original operational timeline, what does that really mean? It means millions of costs and months, if not years, delay to a sponsor. And some of the recent data has shown that for every day a clinical trial is delayed, it's a $40,000 cost to a sponsor just to operationalize that trial. So that's just for the trial. On the flip side, for every day that a trial is delayed from market authorization, it could be up to $500,000 a day in lost revenue for a sponsor. So past numbers, you may have attended seminars where it showed maybe $2 to $3, $4 billion, dollars a day in lost revenue. That some recent data has shown that those numbers were quite artificially inflated, and it's probably more about 500,000 right now. So what do we need to do? We need to really look at alternative ways to operationalize clinical trials, bring the trials closer to the patients in order to improve patient access, improve retention, as well as diversification in trials as well.
Thanks, Kim. If I look at it from the patient side, I mean, Kim's talked about the recruitment challenges, but why are they recruitment challenges? What is it stopping patients joining? First of all, geographical barriers. 90% of patients refuse to travel more than 1 hour to a site. I found that data quite astounding, really. Most patients, from other data that I've seen, live more than 2 hours away from a site. So for a visit to a site, you've got to allow a 4-hour round trip, half a day, and that doesn't take into account waiting time at the site and then procedure time before you go back. So it could take the best part of a day for somebody to go to a site and have a blood test or a couple of procedures done. So that puts patients off. It's a barrier. Complex protocols. Kim talked about making protocols much simpler. But again, for patients as well, how many visits do I have to do? What are they taking from me? Why are they taking so much? What other data do I have to provide? Yeah, if you make it complex and increase the burden on the patient, it puts them off. They may come into a study, but they soon realize there's too many demands and they may not have understood it at the beginning, so they drop out. That goes on to patient burden. How many site visits do I have? And what does that do to my daily life? Or if it's it's a pediatric study, what does that do to the parents and their working life? And, where are the sites compared to where I live? So that, again, adds to the attrition and the dropout rates. And the other thing, if you want a diverse population, the typical patient that comes into a clinical trial is a Caucasian of a certain age, maybe the middle age, 50s onwards. They're the people that you see in sites. And if you think of an indication such as prostate cancer, most men in prostate cancer studies are Caucasian patients. The biggest incidence of prostate cancer within the population is in the Black Afro-Caribbean type population. And they don't go into the studies. So you've got drugs that are being developed that may or may not work in that population. So you need the diversity. So again, that lack of going out to the patients leads to a lack of diversity in studies.
Okay, so if we look at the different types of trial design categories, the first on the left over here is fully decentralized. So that's a virtual, type trial design where you may have one investigator that's located in a region or a country where all of the clinical trial procedures are being conducted in an alternative location. So a patient's home, an MRU, which is a mobile research unit, which actually is gaining some nice traction and a little bit more widely available for clinical trials. And that's with companies called, Lightship, who conduct fully virtual trials, as well as a company called EMS here, even in the UK. They've got a quite impressive fleet of mobile research units as well. But when you look at fully virtual trials, it doesn't suit all patient populations. So if you have complex interventions required or challenging in-person assessments that are required with specialists, there may be challenges to implementing fully virtual. And this is where the hybrid model right in the middle of the slide here comes into play. And this is where you have a mix of traditional brick and mortar sites with some decentralized methodologies or many decentralized methodology to balance the patient convenience, but still maintaining that site expertise and the PI oversight, close PI oversight of the trial. So hybrid clinical trials do have pre-identified when you're building the protocol, certain visits that can be conducted in the alternate locations, and they'll also identify which ones absolutely have to be done in the clinic as well, or in the true brick and mortar sites. We'll get into a little bit more detail on future slides of what can be done in a decentralized arena. But right now, it's a very nice component to help deal with some of the challenges we mentioned in the previous slide. Over to the right here, you have fully centralized or traditional brick and mortar sites, right, where the patients are required to go back to the clinic for every single visit, possibly even drug administration, every assessment, and that's where it's a little bit more of the challenge. So you see, it's really a scope of opportunities here with decentralized trial designs.
Thank you.
Can I just ask a question? Sorry, can I go back 2 slides and where we've got that nice little diagram of reasons why studies don't recruit?
Yes.
So, okay, my experience is I tend to work for very small biotech companies. And I would say that generally, when they design a protocol, they are looking to get the most that they can get out of any one patient participant. And that may be that there are extra bloods, extra PK and PD samples. And the reason I think they do that is they have limited budgets and they want to try and collect as much information as possible from any one study. So I do agree, you know, we've had many conversations that the visits are too onerous and there's too much going on at any one visit day. But it's difficult to say no when you know that you've only got maybe 5 patients and you need to get the most data out of those patients that you can. So I think that's maybe truer in bigger companies, but for smaller companies it's very difficult. They do have complex protocols.
Yeah, especially when especially with rare and orphan indications,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
And I think with regard to recruitment challenges, I think investigators sometimes are their own worst enemy, because you go with them with an open kind of, this is what you want to do. How many patients can you enroll or think about enrolling? And you base your recruitment timelines on the estimates that they are providing to you. I mean, you do your due diligence and you look at doing the feasibility, etc. But a lot of it is in the companies, the size companies that I'm working with, a lot of it is based on the feedback that they're getting from investigators as to how long some of these things will take. So if someone says to them, oh yeah, this is an easy protocol to recruit, I can do 10 patients a month, which is absolute nonsense. We all know that. You kind of base your timelines around that. So I think there's an element of that sites need to be more realistic about what they can actually deliver.
Yeah, 100%. I think probably Gaurang and I both agree with you. I absolutely agree with what you're saying. And I do know that, especially with rare and orphan indications, you want to get the most out of that patient and that study. And when I've talked to sites, so there's 2 phases of feasibility, right? And site feedback. When sites are being approached for a study with a final protocol, final inclusion, exclusion, and saying, okay, tell me what you can do. And they come back with I can roll 100 patients a month. I'll even go higher than the 10, right? I mean, because it is always artificially inflated, right? I think I used to say half and then half it again and then half it again. And that might be a realistic number that you'll get. But, they're going to say what they feel they have to say in order to get that trial, because they may have patients that they desperately want to enroll in that trial. But I think what we're talking about too is getting that feedback even during the development of the protocol and the operational strategy from the sites. Sites have told me over and over again that even when they are approached for that feedback during draft protocol review, their feedback normally isn't taken into account, and they actually don't even hear back. on why something was or was not incorporated into a protocol, which just frustrates them more and makes it a little bit harder for them to get on board. So we're actually really encouraging that there's that full feedback loop with some, not just key opinion leaders, but the sites that you're really going to rely on for enrollment, the type of site that you're going to rely on for enrollment for that particular trial as well, and giving them that feedback of, hey, look, we understand that this is going to be a challenge, inclusion, exclusion criteria for points A and B, but we have to institute it because of X, Y, and Z. We need the endpoint. It has to be part of our primary endpoint, whatever it might be, getting that feedback to sites and just knowing that that's probably going to impact enrollment across the board. And I think with the extra data collection that you're looking for, whether it's PK, PD, extra questionnaires, quality, whatever it might be, looking at how you can operationalize that to make it more convenient for the patient, right? So sending, prior to COVID, I would say doing PK sample collection in the home was probably quite limited. It was more done in the site. Once COVID hit, out of necessity, PK samples were collected, and we realized, hey, you actually can do it in the patient's home and still maintain the quality of that sample in the chain of custody. So instituting more of the PK sample collection in the home, or some of the other things that need to be collecting, even with the RMUs, is also quite a possibility. Some sponsors may be uncomfortable with that, so we have to talk to them about, here's how we're going to really ensure that we have quality over all of that data collection and proper chain of custody.
Thank you for the additional information.
Absolutely.
I was just going to add, Kay, actually, I think probably both large pharma, small biotech are equally guilty of trying to do too much in any single protocol. Certainly in larger pharma, you have many more stakeholders to keep happy as well when you're developing a protocol. So I think we're all guilty across the board, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, sorry, I was just checking. Okay. I think I'm good with this one. You can.
So if we look at the rise of decentralized clinical studies or hybrid clinical studies, we seem to be talking about them at every conference as well, but they're not new. They started off in the early to mid 2000s, the first sort of hybrid studies where things were done outside of sites, maybe nurse visits at home. The first fully decentralized study was one by Pfizer in 2011, which was for overactive bladder, where they got patients to feed back information electronically on that one. So that was a fully decentralized study. And then, of course, during COVID, there was an explosion. Nobody could go to sites. So a lot of studies were switched to decentralized. And if you look at the survey that was done in 21, asking sites, how much they were going to use decentralized, at least 94% said they were going to do something decentralized. That was because the sites in the main couldn't get patients back. But moving forward after COVID, the number of decentralized studies stopped or went down significantly. We saw that happening as a provider of decentralized studies. And the whole market stepped back and thought, right, what are we actually doing with them? How do we do them better? And the good news is, if you look at the latest data that we've got here, almost 80% of sponsors are saying that they will be starting some form of hybrid study in 25. That's up from almost 60% last year. So you can see that the momentum is coming back and people are looking at how they can do these in the right way, not just everybody and everything. And the key drivers for this are obviously, we've talked about patient burden, patient demand. It's the patients demanding recruitment to stay in, convenience to stay into studies or join them in the first place. And looking at things like remote visits, looking at things like wearables that reduce their burden for travel, does encourage them to come into a study in the first place. The data shows 2 times faster if you've got some decentralized elements within the study. We've talked about geographic barriers, making it easier for them to take part. Not everything can be done at home or outside of the site. Some things will need to be, but it's the balance, getting it right to make it easier for them to take part, making it easier for carers to take their children to help them take part. It reduces both the travel, but also the financial burden of travel. I know they get reimbursed, but they sometimes have to pay out before they get the money back, and time off work. So there's some key elements there. We have the regulatory authorities. ICH put out their new guidance, the E6R3, in January. And specifically within that, they were talking about patient engagement and site engagement to make sure that protocols were less burdensome, collected the data that was absolutely needed in the easiest way possible to preserve and preserving the data. And national regulators like the FDA, EMA, MHRA, and the CDE in China have put out guidance on how to do decentralized studies. And that's all been positive and driving the thinking. Because previously there was a lot of, well, what can we do and what can't we do? And, will they accept this? So the guidance has already also been helpful in doing that. And if you look at the growth that's expected in the spend on decentralized studies, you can see from 24, where it was estimated to be a 9.5 billion odd, it should be going up to about 21 billion by 2030, a very significant increase. In the 24 number, the majority or the biggest chunk of that was for oncology studies, which isn't surprising, as a lot of focus for pharma is in the oncology space, whether it's rare oncology or other cancers as well. So that's not surprising that it was in oncology. But the important thing is that there is expected growth in the sector.
Do you see more of a hybrid model in oncology, though, Gaurang, rather than fully decentralized?
The short answer to that question is yes. And I've got something that shows you that in a moment.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Gaurang, sorry, I wanted to just ask the folks on the call as well, just going back up one slide, with there you go, thanks. With ICH E6, the R3 coming out in July, are you all seeing any, I don't want to say panic, but additional considerations that sponsors are showing with regards to decentralized trials and the monitoring of them, et cetera? Does anybody have any experience with that on the call?
I don't know.
Okay. We'll talk a little bit about that as well, because that it wasn't, I don't want to say it was a complete overhaul, but there was some significant changes with the new updated version that's being released, or it was released in January. It's being effective in July. So we've had some CROs mostly, but sponsors also asking us about gap analysis with SOPs and things like that. Okay, thank you.
So going back to hybrid studies, which was something that you asked about a moment ago. So there are some key enablers to make hybrid studies successful. One of those is technology. And technology has moved on so much, even since COVID. And it's a great enabler for allowing hybrid studies to take place and making patients feel that they're engaged with the study, retaining them and collecting data, particularly real world data. Data points that you would not have collected if it was down to every single site visit. You can collect data on how the medication is performing on an everyday basis with patients. So technology is important. Remote services, whether it's home nursing, whether it's alternate sites. In the US, there's a big push to use brick and mortar pharmacies as intermediate points where patients don't want to have a nurse in their home. They can go to a Walgreens or it used to be a CVS, but they tone that service down. So they can go there and have samples collected and data collected as well. You need good logistics around this. It's not just about nursing. It's not just about technology. You need to get IMP to patients' homes. You need to get samples back from patients' home and do it in the right temperature controlled manner with all the chain of custody elements to it and the proof that everything was kept at the right temperature. So it's a complex logistics process around that as well to move that, and also sometimes equipment as well. Nurses can centrifuge product in a patient's home, so you need to be able to move that equipment around as well. But absolutely key is the initial site and patient education, in my experience. You can set up a brilliant study, but if the PI, first of all, isn't bought into the decentralized elements, isn't understanding of it, doesn't see the value in this, doesn't see how it's going to help them, they will never buy into a study, and they won't recommend it to their patients. So you need great education for the PIs and their ability to take that education and convince patients that this is a good thing for them as well. I have seen studies, and Kim has as well, where we were promised 100 sites with 10% of their patients that would all be taking home healthcare or decentralized things, and it never materialized because the site says, we don't need it, we don't want to use it, we want our patients to come back. So patient education and site buying is extremely important in this. When we talk about digital elements and technology, there are now a plethora of tools out there that can support us with this. I mean, the basic tools of e-consent, e-COA, and e-patient reported outcomes, the technology is there to take that data and put it into the clinical trial systems at the sites. But there's some great things going on with biometric sensors, where the data from those sensors is connected and straightly put into systems like RAVE from Medidata. You've got in-home connected virtual assistants. So there are things like Keep Labs who have an adherence box which can be refrigerated or just hold tablets, and it will tell the patients when their next dose is due, note that it's been opened, note that the weight of the medication has been removed from the box, so it's actually been taken out. And so you can monitor adherence with that through that. Apple are working on a trial using their technology and collecting patient data to see if there's a connection between data that they can collect from their wearables and their equipment with the patient's medical records. So there's a trial going on there using just normal technology that we have. So there is a lot of data out there to connect patients and sites and clinicians and collect real world evidence. Key to all of this is to make sure the systems all talk to each other, because where you have a site that has to connect into 3 different systems to look at data and then move data across from one to the other, that's causing issues. So you may be collecting data, but then you're making it more difficult for the site to work with it. If we look at decentralization, it doesn't mean siteless studies. That's a given. When you use the word DCT normally, people think of technology and it doesn't have sites, but no. 80% of studies are hybrid. There will be a place for complete DCTs where you have one site looking after many patients, but they will be much fewer than the ones where there is a bit of both. Even if you talk to patients, and you can see on the chart on the right, the number of patients that actually want to mix the things. This was a study carried out in rare disease patients, and at the end number is 148, you can see there. But 57% of those patients wanted a mix of home and site. They value the connection with the site and the clinicians, but they want some of the easier stuff done at home. And 48% wanted the same for the medications as well. So you can see that the patients are happy to have a mix. Overall, 87% of them had no concerns about having a decentralized study or bits of it that were decentralized. So patients are good with it. Patients want a mix. So why still have sites? Well, sites are important for the regulatory compliance and the data integrity. They still have a key role to play there, collecting that data, completing the documentation for the trial master files. site expertise is still required for complex procedures. Can't do biopsies, you can't do CT scans or any other complex activities outside of a medical facility. And the use of technologies will help the sites with real world evidence. ePros will help the data sets as well. So decentralized studies do have benefits, and they need both players in there. They need the patients to buy in and be part of that, and it will make it easier for them to be in studies, but we also need the sites expertise there to hold the studies together.
Have you found any of that is age related? Because you know, as a carer of an 89-year-old mother, giving my mother something like an something to collect data on or record things in, it would be an impossibility for her. So do you see that the decentralized and kind of like the technology is taken up more by younger clinical trial participants, or do you see also same kind of take up in older generations?
I think that there has to be a choice for the patient, first of all. So it shouldn't be forced upon them. And you're quite right. There will be a group of patients who say, no, I want to go back to the site, or I can't do this. And then you've got to find an alternate for them. Generally, from what we've seen with the home healthcare element of it, it isn't too much age related. You know, people do accept that they can be treated outside of a site and data taken that way. And particularly parents with young children are really open to that. But it doesn't need to be in your home. It could be in your workplace, or it could be somewhere else where you're more comfortable. In terms of technology, yes, we're going to get that. And you've got to allow for that.
Yeah, and I think that's where the feedback from the patient advocates as well for that patient population is critical, to see, okay, the technology, here's the technology we're planning on using. Is it applicable to be used in the decentralized manner, or do they need more guided support in a traditional brick and mortar? But absolutely a consideration for sure.
You know, and then I have my budget head on, and my budget head says to me, okay, you're going to have two kind of systems operating. You're going to have an on-site kind of setup, and you're going to have a decentralized system. And I look at that and I think, well, that's potentially an additional cost. Can I justify that?
100%. And I think that's where you. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I interrupt?
No. I was going to say that would always be my kind of dilemma, I suppose. Well, one of my dilemmas.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, what we have found too with it's when sponsors kind of put feet on both sides and they don't fully embrace the decentralized and plan for the decentralized model and say, okay, sites, this is when we're going to have the decentralized visits. And here's the operational plan for that. And here are the visits that are going to occur in brick and mortar. And here's the plan for that, and have it kind of fully vetted. It's not cheaper, for sure. So it may end up costing more money, but if it's helping you either meet your originally established timelines, exceed them in certain cases, or not extend them, you know, you've got that cost savings, right? When again, we talked about $40,000 a day in just operational cost for every day that your trial is delayed, or $500,000 a day in lost revenue on average for a compound for trials. So, or for a pharmaceutical company. So I think if you look at that in the bigger picture and weigh the ROI with that, that's where you're going to be able to make the decision of, yeah, we absolutely need to have decentralized, or we really don't. It's kind of a nice to have. This population's better in a brick and mortar. Because, you know, we talked about virtual trials aren't always great for all protocol designs. It's the same thing for hybrid. It may just not be a good solution. But I think what we're really encouraging is getting that feedback from the patients and from the sites straight away to make those final decisions and then follow that plan.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's worth mentioning as well that remote might also get you better results. I remember doing respiratory studies at Galapagos, and the patients were so exhausted from going to a centralized center that they could almost not do a 6-minute walk test. They had to sit down for 3 hours and recover before they could do it. If there was a way to calibrate that or measure it by steps or to do some sort of analog measure, then you actually got them in the wild in a more natural data set. Now, it may be you need to do both, but possibly you do more remotely and then you do more structurally less often to validate. But we found with elderly patients, they were so exhausted that very often the results were diminished just because they'd spent a whole day getting to the site.
Yeah, and that's I mean, that's a great example of it. Just to answer that question, I was at the Medidata Next meeting in London last month, and they demonstrated a different way of reproducing the walk test electronically at home, so the patient can do a normal walk without having to go around a circuit, and that data was still, they were validating it against a 6-minute walk test, and they're hoping that that will become a norm going forward. They're working through the validation process and getting the regulators to accept it at the moment. So yeah, it's evolving. A 6-minute walk test, when people came to us and said, can you do that at home? No, we couldn't do that.
Yeah. And I think, you know, with taking on some of these decentralized ways of approach, Michelle's got a comment in here on why maybe the patient feedback or the site feedback is not being taken by the sponsors. I think there's just a bit of risk aversion. I'd love everybody's comments on that. So you may get the feedback from the patients, but when you have, you know, 5 other compounds historically that have their protocol designs and how the drug was approved for market authorization with certain primary endpoints and certain tests being done, it's hard to get sponsors to take a risk with doing things a little bit out of that norm. Now that you've got the updated ICH E6 guidelines that show, hey, let's encourage alternate ways to collect the data or alternate ways to do the clinical trials, as well as some of the guidelines that even that the FDA has put out and other regulators that Gaurang have talked to, if it might be easier for folks to take on this risk and to do things more in the in more realistic ways that meet the patient's need as well. I think we'll see a lot more, as you know, I mentioned in the chat how I'm seeing so many organizations that have had like chief patient officers. Maybe they've gone away for a little bit. Now they're coming back. A lot of the CROs have them. A lot of the sites have them. I think as we see that kind of community growing in industry, I'm hoping that it's going to also push for more realistic protocol designs as well. And then, Gaurang, I think we can go to the next slide, but there was also some discussion about AI in the chat as well. And there's a number of being used for patient recruitment and retention. There's some potential companies here that were noted in here. I've seen a huge, push at the conferences. Scope in the US in February had a ton of AI companies that focused in different areas, whether it was retention and recruitment, protocol design consideration, also project management support. But there's some sites. There's a site network called Veda Trials. There's other site networks as well that have instituted AI to support reviewing inclusion/exclusion criteria. So it integrates with a community, the site network of patients. It can look through the EMR, integrate with it, and utilize AI to help find the most appropriate patients. So you're taking away.
What's the name of that company, Kimberly? Veda.
It's called Veda, VEDA, Veda Trials. They're in the US right now. They just launched in the US, but I know that there's others as well that I can get some names to as well. But that's really interesting because the other big challenge with sites is that they don't have the resources to look for the patients, especially at your academic institutions for inclusion/exclusion criteria. So if you're taking off a manual resource that could take weeks and weeks and weeks to look through their EMR into now just minutes with the AI integration, that's huge. It'll tell you right up front, and let's get this instituted during the feasibility stage as well to even further support why a certain inclusion exclusion criteria isn't realistic. Okay. Any other contributions or thoughts from the team on this, the folks on the call? Okay, great. Thank you. This is good. This is great. Thank you so much for the comments and the participation. Okay, I think we've talked through a lot of this right here. I won't regurgitate again what we've talked through in previous slides, but again, during the design phase is really just consider the PI and the site burden as well as the patient burden on your protocol design. The technology systems, Gaurang went through the different technologies that we have, but I think my message here is we really need to make it easier on the sites. And some of the companies are doing that, right? They're looking to have an integration platform where a site only has one login. They can get all of the technology or access to the technologies across a clinical trial very easily with, just one login versus having 10 or 15 different systems to access. But I think that that's really critical. And the greater the burden on the site, the less you're going to have their attention to actually take on the study and enroll. The DCT process, we've talked about. Investigator oversight. When you have a decentralized trial model, it's critical to still demonstrate and document how the investigator is going to maintain oversight of that patient and of the trial. So what's that full feedback mechanism? If you're having, IV infusion, infusion of the medication happening weekly at a patient's home, how is the investigator receiving that data back on concomitant meds or adverse events, or even possibly, SAEs that may occur? So really making sure that that's well thought out and documented in your safety management plan and or your other manuals is critical. And then patient safety considerations, really considering the product that's being studied. This has to be done at the beginning anyway. IRBs and ECs are going to ask the question of how are you maintaining patient safety in a decentralized way, making sure that you have it documented of is that compound the right one to be administered in a non-traditional brick and mortar site. So I have an example of a compound that had a pretty significant safety profile, and it was an infusion biologic with a risk of anaphylactic shock. And, the IRBs and the ECs overwhelmingly came back and said, you're in your regular protocol, you're wanting to monitor these patients closely for the first 3 months. You can't even touch a home health care administration until you've looked at them for, 3 to 6 months in a brick and mortar clinic. So it's just, again, all of this can be worked around very thoughtfully with a solid strategy. You just have to make sure that you identify those components up front.
Okay, so this is maybe a dark question, but okay, you've got this decentralized study going on. You've got you've got patients being treated at home. How are you collating all the information to put it into one, I suppose, electronic ECRF? How? Maybe that's something that everybody is intuitive, but for me, it's like you usually have all your data in one place, or 2 or 3 places it gets entered in. Do you have multiple people entering data?
Yeah, so that most of the time, if you're doing things in a decentralized manner, if we're doing it in a patient's home, there's the home healthcare providers are typically collecting the source documents, right? So they'll have the site source documents that's generated or geared for the home, specific to the home visit, that they'll complete, and they'll submit it either electronically or through, the good old paper method to the site.
Yeah,
exactly. And then the site's entering that data in. If it's other electronic items, like let's say EKGs, and you're using a centralized reader, or you're using a centralized EKG provider, then maybe that's more electronic and it's integrated with the rest of the data, the way the rest of the data is for that trial. So it just depends on the data collection, but source document completion still is important as well.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm just conscious of time. We've got about 7 minutes left.
Okay.
So move on.
Okay. So again, we've kind of talked through a lot of this, but again, what we saw in COVID, those protocols that were able to remain relatively, I don't want to say unaffected, but had little interruption in their clinical trial were the ones that had some sort of decentralization worked into the protocol already. So they maybe had high level wording of, visits 1, 2, and 3, or 3, 5, 9, whatever it might be, could be conducted in a decentralized way. And they had a general already note in the protocol about that. They were the ones that were able to institute decentralized trials quite quickly because of that, right? They kind of got a blanket approval from IRBs and ECs to move forward. The strategy, however, may not have been worked out, and the sponsors were left with finding the vendors and the technologies that they needed in order to institute the decentralization piece of it. So what we're encouraging is that not only do you have it written into the protocol, but it's very thoughtful, and you have your vendors identified. You get the most suitable vendors, and you really encourage sponsors to take on that decentralized component, not limit it as if necessary, if required due to X, Y, and Z. And you just, really engage in that because it's for the benefit of the patients, right? And most of the time sites then, if they know exactly what the operational plan is, how the study is kind of designed and expected to be conducted, you'll have a better chance of them adhering to it and utilizing it as well. Because again, decentralized trials are for the benefit of the patient to minimize the patient burden, but you have to have sites fully engaged in that as well in order to continue on and make sure you meet patient enrollment and retention. And then quality by design is a must, right? Really thinking about how you're going to maintain that quality across the entire project, not just the decentralized piece of it, and making sure you have the right systems, the right processes, even SOPs from a client perspective that's talking about the decentralized piece of it. Okay. So just quickly here, I think, there's some core areas that you want to think about when deciding on if decentralized trials is right for a particular protocol design. Obviously, we've got them over here to the left: phase of study, the target population, the therapeutic area, the profile of the treatment under investigation, as well as then your site and patient feedback. So it's kind of pulling all of that together here. But what works really well are studies that have frequent site visits, where there's that visit fatigue for patients, if you will, by going back and forth to the clinic numerous times over the course of a few months or many months, as well as the therapeutic area and the disease. As you mentioned, the respiratory challenges of just getting the patients to the clinic and the fatigue they may feel with doing that, and then how it impacts the testing that's being done. Frequent infusions or injections to help relieve the burden on the patients for doing at-home study drug administration. And then also other patient area targets with mobility issues, pediatric, elderly patients, patients that may require caregivers to also take them back. So now you're not only coordinating for the caregiver, but they're also having to figure out, okay, how am I going to, get my child to the clinic when I have work or, 5 other children to take care of, et cetera. Right. An area where I particularly like decentralized models is the long-term outcome studies or real-world evidence. So if you've got a long-term cardiovascular outcome trial that goes on for 5, 6, 7 years, and you tend to lose patients at the end, and that data is so critical, really turning it around and having the study go to the patient in order not to lose them and still to be able to collect, lab samples quarterly or whatever it might be. So again, there's a lot of benefit here. There's a lot of ways you can use it to keep the patients engaged and reduce that dropout, as well as just relieve the overall burden of caregivers and patients in whole. Okay.
just very quickly, there's a case study just wanted to share with you, and it fits all those parameters that Kim have been talking about. So you've got a rare disease, pediatric disease, inherited disease there, and you've got very few patients over a wide geography. So in the US, they need to fly to centers in different states. In Europe, they may need to go to different countries. And they needed weekly infusions and regular blood collections. That's a huge burden on the patients, with the children, and also their carers, parents. What was the approach? Well, we engaged a mobile nursing network, which had both pediatric infusion nurses, because for pediatrics, you need specialized nurses, and pediatric phlebotomists for the blood sample collections. They worked very closely with the sites. The sites have to buy into these nurses that are working on their behalf. They actually delegate authority to work under the PI. So the sites needed to be comfortable with the nurses, and that connection was made so they had trust in each other. Then we needed to deliver the medication to the patients' homes, wherever they may be. But then this was an infusion that needed to be made up. The stability was 24 to 48 hours. So we needed it made up and with the patient the next day at the right temperature, so it didn't degrade. And we needed all of the tracking and the chain of custody and the temperature tracking to all be documented and sent back to the site. So it was a complex operation to do that. But the outcome was the recruitment was achieved. More patients joined the study because they were able to. And, parents were saying things like, we're grateful because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to do this. And we were able to provide the treatments and the scheduled sampled collections. I've gone through that very quickly because I'm conscious of time. But this case study is on the Phraktion website. Final slide.
Yeah, and so really, hopefully we've demonstrated that hybrid trials can really have a great benefit to patients and to sites as well by meeting the patients where they are, but also maintaining that critical site expertise and oversight. The principal investigators, the sites, they're not going away. And the majority of studies don't meet that ability to conduct in a fully virtual setting. So it's having that balance between brick and mortar and decentralized that's going to be critical in helping to reduce enrollment timelines and dropout rates. So I just, I guess Gaurang and I just want to thank everyone for joining today. I hope you're able to get some little glimmers of new information out of the presentation. And if you have any questions and you want to have a follow-up chat, please feel free to reach out to us. We love talking about this stuff. It really is our passion and one of the areas that we focus at in bioclinical solutions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I know we only have a minute left here, but are there any other questions?
Burning questions, final questions. But, you know where to find Kim and Gaurang. And if you can't find them, you can find me, I'm sure. So just there we go. So, but thank you then, Kim and Gaurang. So certainly your passion is coming through around clinical trials and how to make them better into the future. And I think my old colleague Kate will share with you that I've been banging on for many years now that really things do need to change in the clinical trial world. I'm fed up of having the same conversations over decades, and I think you're leading the way here, and we should look at that very enthusiastically into the future and try and do clinical trials a little bit better for patients, of course, and then bringing new therapies in a more efficient way for everybody. So with that, thank you. And, I think once again demonstrates the huge expertise we have available at Phraktion. And really, we have the best brains in the room across industry right now. And, let's recognise that and try and spread the word that that's what we have at Phraktion and always demonstrated so well in our webinars. So with that, we'll be back in 2 or 3 weeks' time. So look out for the next fantastic webinar. Thank you, everybody. Bye now.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.